What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Wednesday, February 1st. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, let's take a look at this 9-game NBA slate tonight. So at the point guard position, I like Ja Morant from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Portland Trailblazers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and their middle-of-the-pack defending opposing point guards. Ja Morant has averaged 49.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 35% usage rate. He's projected at 47.4 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 55 fantasy points or more and get you over 5 times value. He's 10,400 DraftKings salary, 200 less on FanDuel, and Ja Morant has scored 72, 59, and 58 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 41, 38, and 35 minutes. Also, Ja Morant has scored 42, 70, and 44 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Trailblazers. Hasn't scored under 46 in his last 4 games. So I like Ja Morant here versus the Portland Trailblazers. Okay, another point guard that I like is Chris Paul from the Phoenix Suns playing the Atlanta Hawks, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing point guards, but Chris Paul has averaged 36.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He's projected at 36 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 40 fantasy points or more in this one and get you 5 times value or more. And he's 8,300 DraftKings salary, the same price on FanDuel. Now, Chris Paul has scored 42, 64, and 49 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 39, and 38 minutes. So he's been playing over his season average in minutes, and that's been putting him over the 40 fantasy point mark, which makes him a pretty good value play here. Now, if his minutes do come back down to 30 to 32 minutes, it will be harder for him to hit value at this price tag, but he's still, this is a guy that can put up 50 to 60 plus fantasy points. Oh, and also Chris Paul has scored 49, 48, 22, 30, and 34 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Hawks. So kind of a mixed bag there, but his last 2 games, 49 and 48 fantasy points. So I think that puts him in a pretty good spot. Chris Paul is one of those guys that if he doesn't crush value, like maybe he does score 35, 36 fantasy points, but he probably won't kill your lineup. That's why I kind of like to play Chris Paul. He seems to be underpriced a lot of times, or priced just low enough where he has a high ceiling and his floor isn't too low here. So anyways, I like Chris Paul here versus the Atlanta Hawks. Okay, another point guard that I like is De'Aaron Fox from the Sacramento Kings playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the worst defense overall, give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing point guards. De'Aaron Fox has averaged 40.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He's projected at 39.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. He's 8,200 DraftKings salary, 400 more on FanDuel. And I like this pick because it's a fantastic matchup. And also, Vegas thinks they're going to score 244.5 points in this game. So a super high scoring game. One of the best matchups on the slate. And De'Aaron Fox has scored 50, 46, and 32 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 41, 34, and 30 minutes. And on top of that, it's got a pretty good track record here versus the Spurs. He scored 29, 47, 56, and 56 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Spurs. So certainly has that 50 plus fantasy point upside. So I like De'Aaron Fox here versus the San Antonio Spurs. So another point guard that I like, also eligible at the shooting guard position. He's played pretty heavy minutes the past couple of games and has scored pretty well. So Malcolm Brogdon from the Boston Celtics playing the Brooklyn Nets. He's getting more playing time here because of the injury to Marcus Smart. So Malcolm Brogdon played 39 and 34 minutes in the last 2 games, scored 46 and 27 fantasy points. And I just think that he could be a good play here tonight. Now, he's $6,500 DraftKings salary, $500 less on FanDuel. So I think he could be a good FanDuel play here at only $6K. He's got a good matchup. He could be playing 35 to 40 minutes, and he does have that 40-plus fantasy point upside, and it's a good matchup. So I'm not in love with the play, but I do think Malcolm Brogdon is in a good spot here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. I like Bradley Beal from the Washington Wizards playing the Detroit Pistons, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Bradley Beal has averaged 36.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. Now, he's projected at 36.4 fantasy points here tonight, which is basically his season average, and that's 5 times value. He's $7,300 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 236 points scored in this game. Bradley Beal has scored 45, 29, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 29, 32, and 29 minutes. And Bradley Beal scored 27 and 37 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Pistons. I just think there's a lot of upside with this play. If he scores 36 fantasy points, that's 5 times value, and he's certainly capable of putting up a 40-plus fantasy point performance in a good matchup in a somewhat high-scoring game here. So I like Bradley Beal here versus the Detroit Pistons. Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won. And then we'll send you $25 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you. Another shooting guard that I like is Anthony Simmons from the Portland Trail Blazers playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing shooting guards. Anthony Simmons has averaged 33.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 25% usage rate. He's projected at 34.3 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.4 times value. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary, same price on FanDuel. And Anthony Simmons has scored 37, 25, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 40, and 38 minutes. So I like this play because even if Anthony Simmons scores his season average of 33.7 fantasy points, that'll still be over 5 times value. He's playing a ton of minutes. He's got 35 plus fantasy point upside. Let's see what he's done against Memphis. And another thing here that I like is he scored 47 and 47 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Grizzlies. So not so well in the games before that. but I think that is encouraging that he scored 47 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Grizzlies. So we know he has close to 50 fantasy point upside against this team. So I like Anthony Simmons here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Okay, now here's kind of a sleeper pick, a high risk, high reward play here, low salary. Take a look at Colin Sexton from the Utah Jazz playing the Toronto Raptors, who have a good defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing shooting guards. Colin Sexton has averaged 22.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 24 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He's projected at 22.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's $4,400 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 230.5 points scored in this game. Now, Colin Sexton has scored 19, 29, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 19, 21, and 20 minutes. So he's playing a little bit under his season average in minutes. But take a look at this. He's averaging 0.95 fantasy points per minute. So it's just about how many minutes he can get on the court here tonight. If this guy plays 24 to 25 minutes, he's going to have probably over 20 fantasy points and giving you over 5 times value. And if he gets hot, he could score 30 fantasy points or more. You see he scored 29. So he's got 30 plus fantasy point upside. So it's a pretty high ceiling. So I like Colin Sexton as a sleeper pick or a high risk, high reward play here versus the Toronto Raptors. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. So I like, this play stuck out to me a little bit. I like Tobias Harris from the Philadelphia 76ers playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Tobias Harris also eligible at the power forward position. And he's averaging 31.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. Now he's projected at 30.2 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5 times value. He's $6,000 DraftKings salary, $400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 230.5 points scored in this game. Tobias Harris has scored 26, 27, and 27 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 32, 32, and 32 minutes. So you can see he's just been underperforming his season averages on both fantasy points per game and minutes played per game. He's been underperforming those averages for the last 3 games. So if he can just get a couple extra minutes here, he should be able to get you 5 times value. And we know he's got 40 plus fantasy point upside. It's a good matchup here. So I like Tobias Harris here versus the Orlando Magic. Now another value play that I think is interesting here is Denny Avdija from the Washington Wizards playing the Detroit Pistons, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing small forwards. Denny Avdija has averaged 22.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. But I want you to take a look at his last 3 games. He played 33, 27, and 29 minutes. And he scored 42, 32, and 33 fantasy points. And you can see his usage rate the last 3 games has been well over his season average as well. 21, 18, and 19% usage rate for the last 3 games. Well over his season average of 16%. And his minutes per game, the last 3 games, well over his season average of 26. And of course his production well over his season average here. So I think the price is still catching up. You can see he's only projected at 22.2 fantasy points here tonight. But I think even these projection models are still catching up here because he's only averaging 26 minutes per game on the season, scoring an average of 22.9 fantasy points. So a projection of 22.2 fantasy points seems reasonable. But if you look at just the last 3 games, that projection seems quite low. So let's give him a projection of 30 fantasy points, and let's go ahead and see what that value would be if he scores 30 fantasy points. Where's my Nvidia? Where's Denny? Okay, so Denny Avidja, 30 fantasy points at 5,400 DraftKings salary is 5.6 times value. So he's got the opportunity to crush value here if he continues to play minutes like he has for the last 3 games, and he continues to be productive. He's averaging 0.9 fantasy points per minute. So I like Denny Avidja, who's got mixed results here versus the Pistons, but he's got a 27, a 43, a 12, a 38, and a 20. But I think he's a good risk to reward play here, a good value play. So I like Denny Avidja here versus the Detroit Pistons. Okay, another small forward that I like is Josh Hart from the Portland Trailblazers playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have the middle of the pack defense overall. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Josh Hart has averaged 28 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 13% usage rate. He's projected at 29.1 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.7 times value. He's only 5,100 DraftKings salary. Now he is 1,100 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. And Josh Hart scored 34 fantasy points last game in 34 minutes. So if he's back to playing 33 to 34 minutes a game on average, I think we could expect him to get at least 30 fantasy points here tonight. And that is 5.7 times value on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. So I like Josh Hart here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. So, a stud on the slate that I think is interesting here, although we only have a 1-game sample size since he came back. But take a look at Kristaps Porzingis from the Washington Wizards playing the Detroit Pistons, who have the 3rd worst defense overall and give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Kristaps Porzingis has averaged 42.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 27% usage rate. Now he's projected at 41.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.6 times value. But we all know he's got 50 plus fantasy point upside, so that would be over 5 times value. He's 9,000 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 236 points scored in this game. And Kristaps Porzingis scored 54 fantasy points last game, played 30 minutes. So if he plays 32, 33 minutes here tonight in a good matchup, I think he could be an interesting play. In his last 2 games versus the Pistons, he scored 31 and 57 fantasy points. So he clearly has that 50 plus fantasy point upside. So I like Kristaps Porzingis here versus the Detroit Pistons. Another power forward that I like is Jeremiah Grant from the Portland Trailblazers playing the Memphis Grizzlies. I think this game is a good game to stack. And the Grizzlies have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jeremiah Grant has averaged 34 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He's projected at 33.9 fantasy points here tonight. which is, a hair under his season average, basically his season average, and that's 5.1 times value. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel, so I think it's a fair price on both sites. He's in a good matchup. And Jeremiah Grant has scored 31, 47, and 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 40, and 42 minutes. So gives me quite a bit of confidence in this play. He's playing a ton of minutes. He's been productive. Nice season average in a good matchup. The price is right. So I like Jeremiah Grant here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Another power forward that I like is Draymond Green. And I've been picking him a lot lately, but I've been picking the spots that I think that he's had some good matchups and some good player versus team history. And this is another one. It's a good matchup and it's a high scoring game. So take a look at Draymond Green from the Golden State Warriors playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have a middle of the pack defense overall, give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Draymond Green has averaged 30.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 12% usage rate. He's projected at 28.7 fantasy points here tonight. Now, that's only 4.5 times value, so I think he is somewhat of a risky play. It's not like he's super cheap or anything, but I do think that he can score 35 fantasy points or more in this matchup. And let's just see what that would be for value if he can score 35 at the power forward position. Also eligible at the center position. Where's my Draymond Green? Where's my Draymond? There he is. Draymond Green, 35 fantasy points would be 5.5 times value. So he's 6,400 DraftKings salary, 700 more on FanDuel. Now, I like this pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 239 points scored in this game, and Draymond Green has scored 39, 23, and 40 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 31, 32, and 32 minutes, and he did score 47 fantasy points in his last game versus the Timberwolves. So I like Draymond Green here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, moving on to the center position, I like DeAndre Ayton from the Phoenix Suns playing the Atlanta Hawks, who have the 6th worst defense overall, give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing centers. DeAndre Ayton has averaged 35.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He's projected at 33.6 fantasy points here tonight. Now, this projection, I think is a little bit low. He's played really well recently. Let's see what his value would be if we gave him a projection of 38 fantasy points, which, considering the minutes in his production in the last 3 games, I think is reasonable. So let's take a look at DeAndre Ayton. Okay, so that would be 4.9 times value. So it looks like he's going to need about 39 fantasy points to get you 5 times value or more. So DeAndre Ayton is 7,800 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel, and he scored 42, 39, and 52 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 31, 36, and 31 minutes. Then he had usage rates of 28, 27, and 41% the last 3 games, well over his 24% season average. So that all bodes well. And he's in a good matchup, and he's had decent success here versus the Hawks. Scored 25, 26, 36, and 38 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Hawks. But I think this is a pretty decent center pick here. I do think he's got a good chance to get you 45 fantasy points or more and crush value. So I like DeAndre Ayton here versus the Atlanta Hawks.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching.
Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.